They say every neighborhood has secrets. But what if the biggest secret is that the very people meant to protect your home are the ones who make it a living nightmare? Welcome to Willow Creek. On the surface, it looked like paradise. Perfectly painted houses lined the streets, manicured lawns stretched endlessly, hedges trimmed with military precision, and mailboxes standing in flawless rows. To an outsider, it was the picture of peace and order, but for the people living inside, it was something else entirely. Because behind those picket fences and tidy flower beds, there was a woman who ruled over it all. Her name was Margaret. To strangers, she looked like the perfect neighbor. An older woman with pearl necklaces, pastel cardigans, and a polite smile that never seemed to leave her face. She baked cookies for new residents, hosted holiday events, and spoke sweetly at church gatherings. But inside Willow Creek, her reputation was very different. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the queen of the neighborhood, and her word was law. If your grass grew an inch too high, you'd get a letter. If your curtains didn't match the approved color scheme, there would be a fine. Even kids leaving their bikes on the sidewalk for a few minutes could result in a warning taped to the front door. The people of Willow Creek lived in silence. Everyone smiled on the outside, but deep down, they were afraid of Margaret. No one dared to challenge her. No one. Until David arrived. David wasn't the kind of man who went looking for fights. He was a single father, doing his best to raise his teenage daughter Emily after the death of his wife. His life wasn't easy. Long shifts at work, bills piling up, and the struggles of parenthood, but he found joy in two things: his daughter and his old red Mustang. That car wasn't just a machine, it was a memory. A piece of his late father who had spent countless hours working on it with him. Every scratch, every bolt, every shine of the polished hood carried years of love and effort. To David, the Mustang wasn't just a car, it was family. When he bought the little house in Willow Creek, he parked it proudly in the driveway, gleaming under the sun. It was his way of saying, "This is home now." But Margaret didn't see it that way. The very next morning, as David sorted through his mail, he found it. A letter. Official HOA stationery, cold words typed across the page. "Your vehicle is in violation of HOA policy. Remove it immediately or face fines." David frowned, reading it twice. Violation. How? The car was spotless, fully registered, in perfect working condition. He thought it had to be a mistake, but it wasn't. It was Margaret. At first, David ignored it. But then came another letter and another. Second notice. Final warning. The words grew bolder, the tone harsher. Then came the fines. $100, then $200, then $500. David's confusion turned to frustration. He knew the car wasn't breaking any real rule. It wasn't junk. It wasn't abandoned. It was his pride. Still, Margaret didn't stop. At the monthly HOA meeting, David finally decided to speak. He brought Emily with him, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. The room was filled with his neighbors, sitting stiffly in folding chairs, eyes lowered, hands clasped nervously in their laps. David stood. His voice was steady but firm. "This car is clean, registered, operational. It's not hurting anyone. I've followed every guideline. There's no reason for these fines." The room was silent. No one spoke. No one dared. At the head of the table, Margaret leaned forward. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were sharp, like a knife hidden in velvet. "Rules are rules, Mr. Davis," she said sweetly, tapping her manicured fingers against the papers before her. "Driveways are not for unsightly displays." Emily's eyes widened. Unsightly? The car was shining like new. David clenched his fists, but said nothing. He looked around the room, searching for support, for anyone to speak up, but all he saw were lowered eyes. neighbors who had been through the same thing and chosen silence. That night, David drove home with his daughter in tears beside him. For the first time, he realized it wasn't just about a car. It was about control. But Margaret wasn't finished. One morning, David stood in the kitchen brewing coffee when he heard it, the growl of an engine outside. He frowned, set down his cup, and looked out the window. His blood ran cold. A tow truck, in his driveway, chains rattling as they hooked onto his Mustang. He ran outside, heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. The driver avoided his eyes. "HOA order," he muttered, and there she was, Margaret, standing at the curb, her pressed suit immaculate, her pearls gleaming, her arms folded like a queen overseeing her victory. "You were warned, Mr. Davis," she said calmly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Perhaps now you'll learn to follow
The rules." David's neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, their faces pale. Some filmed from their porches. No one stepped forward. Emily stood on the front steps, tears streaking down her cheeks. That sight, her heartbreak, ignited something inside David. The rules. He stepped between the truck and his car, his fists clenched, his voice low, but steady. "You're not taking it. Not today. Not ever." The tow truck driver froze. He glanced at the crowd forming, at Margaret, at David's burning eyes. His hands hesitated on the chains. Margaret's face reddened, her smile faltering. For the first time, cracks showed in her authority. And then it happened. A voice rose from the crowd. "He's right." It was Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor who had lived in Willow Creek for decades. She stepped forward, her cane tapping against the pavement. "That car isn't hurting anyone." "Margaret, you've gone too far," another voice followed, then another. Soon, half the street stood behind David, years of silence melting into courage. The tow truck driver, sensing the shift, quietly unhooked the chains and drove away. Margaret stood frozen, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting across the faces of the neighbors who no longer looked at her with fear, but with defiance. David exhaled, placing his hand gently on the hood of his car. Relief washed over him. But this wasn't just about saving his Mustang. It was about something bigger. He had sparked a fire. Days passed, but Willow Creek wasn't the same. Neighbors who once avoided each other now whispered in hushed voices. Stories came out about the fines, the warnings, the letters that had haunted them for years. People began to realize they weren't alone. On a warm Saturday evening, the community gathered at the clubhouse, the same place Margaret had always ruled. But this time, the seat at the head of the table sat empty. Mrs. Jenkins stood. Her voice was firm, though her hands trembled. "It's time we take a vote. For too long, we've been silent." And our silence gave Margaret her power. No more hands rose, one after another. The decision was unanimous. Margaret was removed. Relief swept the room. Applause filled the air. Neighbors embraced, some with tears in their eyes. And David, he sat quietly in the back, Emily holding his hand. He hadn't wanted glory. But when his neighbors turned to thank him, when they told him he gave them courage, something inside him stirred. He hadn't just saved his car. He had saved the neighborhood. Later that night, he sat on his porch. The street lamps glowed softly, reflecting off the hood of the Mustang. Emily came outside, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Dad." David smiled, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes, sweetheart, you have to stand up, even if you're standing alone." But he hadn't stood alone. Not anymore. The people of Willow Creek had found their voices. Margaret's shadow no longer loomed over them. And as for Margaret, within weeks, she sold her house. Some said she moved to another town. Others whispered she joined another HOA, where maybe, just maybe, she'd finally learn humility. But in Willow Creek, life flourished again. Lawns weren't perfect, but children laughed freely in driveways. Neighbors talked to each other without fear. Barbecues filled the air with smoke and joy, no longer banned by ridiculous rules. It wasn't perfect anymore, but it was alive. And that was the greatest victory of all.